Yeah, it's fine to record.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, welcome everybody to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are rejoined by one of my favorite journalists, media critics, and geocritics, and all-time peace activist, Rick Sterling, who mainly writes for MintPress News, but also the American International Herald, Globalresearch.ca, Consortium News, part of the Syria Solidarity, all that jazz. Rick, welcome, welcome back to 1+1.
Yeah, good to see you, Youri, and nice to be here.
Likewise, and Rick, before we get into before we get into the topics, now you're based in California. You're based in San Francisco, but are you experiencing the wildfires right now, or you're in a safe area?
We are in a safe area, but we are definitely experiencing the fires. There was one day. Are you okay? Am I coming through?
Yeah.
Basically, it's we're having heavy smoke. There was one day last week where basically it seemed like 9 o'clock at night all day long. The sun never showed up. The temperature dropped 30 degrees from the day before because there was basically very little sunlight coming through, and the atmosphere was red all day. So that was rather a lot of people were commenting on it being apocalyptic. The fires, I was recently talking with friends of mine in Vancouver, Canada, and basically it's more than 1,000 miles along the coast here. The fires in Oregon and California, the smoke from that is it's basically covering a stretch of land over 1,000 miles along the West Coast.
Crazy, and a lot of that is because of climate change, and yet we still have people like, you mentioned your home country of Canada, and I was watching the Green Party leadership debates where twice past guests on this show, Dimitri Lascaris.
Very good.
Yeah, who's running for the leadership of the Green Party, and yet he was literally the only candidate out of 8 that was basically saying that you cannot be an environmentalist and support any form of militarism, whether it's NATO, Five Eyes Alliance, supporting fighter jets, and ratcheting up bad relations with the Chinese and the Russians. The second best candidate, Miriam Haddad, who is the second best, although still not as consistent on the anti-imperialism front when it came to China and Russia. And anywho, it's mind-baffling. It's mind-baffling that even people who call themselves environmentalists want Joe Biden to be the leader, as opposed to Joseph of the Socialist Equality Party, Gloria La Riva of Party for Socialism and Liberation, or Howie Hawkins. But
right, yeah, exactly.
But anywho, speaking of which, that's the first. That actually brings us to our Before we talk about the anti-China Russia hysteria, which I really want to talk to you about, you recently had another article published at the brilliant MintPress News, and since I often invite you to talk all things Syria, give us an update on what's happening in Syria and how Turkey is once again continuing to be a partner in crime in imperialism in Syria.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks, Youri. In the coming days, I actually just have submitted the article, which is titled "How the U.S. and Turkey Are Plundering and Looting Syria with Impunity." That's going to be coming up at various sites in the coming days. So this is, it goes back to the beginning, really, to when the conflict in Syria began in March of 2011. Syria, Turkey, and the USA were already heavily involved. In fact, the terrorists who came in. They came into Syria primarily through Turkey. So that's always been the logistical route for supplies, for weapons, for foreign fighters, and so they have stoked the conflict from the beginning, as well as the U.S. and the so-called international coalition, which they misnamed the Friends of Syria, more accurately known as the enemies of Syria. But
Yeah.
in any case, Turkey has been involved from the get-go. One thing I referred to in the article, which is not very widely known, is that in 2012 and 2013, there was a massive operation where the industrial center of Syria, which is in the outskirts of Aleppo city, the largest city of Syria, the factories were not only attacked, but the expensive, the sophisticated equipment in those factories was dismantled and taken to Turkey. They were taken on flatbed tractor trailers, hundreds of them, transporting and basically looting the industrial infrastructure of Syria. So that that was early on. They basically plundered the resources when Syria had its handful fighting the terrorists. And since that time, the Syrian Arab Army reclaimed the industrial zone of Aleppo, but in large part because of U.S. sanctions, Syria has been unable to rebuild and revitalize the industry the way they need to. So there's a long history of this looting and plundering, but it continues to today. Just a few weeks ago, there was a report. There were multiple reports actually of the electrical infrastructure, power, electrical towers and pylons being downed and dismantled and taken to Turkey. So we've got a constant history of attacks on the infrastructure of Syria going on by Turkey as well as the U.S.
That's just so outstanding. And of course, the Syrian the sovereign Syrian government of Assad, with the help of Russia and a little bit of the help of of Iran and Hezbollah, has managed to basically win the war against the Western Gulf and Israeli forces that have tried to overthrow him. But now the U.S. has decided, and their allies have decided, that okay, we can't win the war militarily, so we're going to try to win the war with sanctions, which is going to still help the Wahhabi forces that they export into Syria, ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, whatever you want to call them. And because you updated us on on the Caesar Act that they're doing in Syria, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Beginning in June, the Caesar Act went into full force. This is a legislation from the U.S. Senate and Congress that was enacted as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. So, and it basically they gave it 6 months to be fully implemented. So in June of this year, the act went into full force, and what it threatens any individual, any company, any country that supplies aid or reconstruction investments or supplies to Syria. So it is a full-on assault on Syrian sovereignty and right to be able to rebuild their country, which has endured 9 years of war. So it's hard to imagine something as amoral as this act, and yet it was a bipartisan measure, shockingly enough, and there's been very little told about what the real consequences are. Now there is a a liberal left or a liberal slant that's coming out now. Some people are saying that Biden may reduce the effect of the sanctions, but other people are saying he's going to actually escalate, and that Syria is going to come under even more intense pressure. Because what they want to do now, they did not overthrow the government.
Syria is Joe Biden's baby. Syria is Joe Biden's baby. All of these crimes against humanity, the Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya project, which they're trying to inflict on Syria, that was under Obama. Joe Biden was the vice president. The ghastly Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State during that time. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Joe Biden becomes president, if they want to really finish that job, since the Trump administration has a very multiple personality disorder when it comes to Syria. On the one hand, I think Trump actually really does want to end the war in Syria for all the right reasons that he said he was opposed to the war. But of course, the deep state doesn't want that. And anytime he wants to pull the troops out, some false flag operation happens. And then, of course, if he's seen as being buddies with Putin, Trump immediately goes, okay, we're going to continue to destroy Syria.
Right. Well, regarding Trump, I was hopeful that he was sincere in wanting to reduce a troop presence. I think there's an element of that, but the fact is the man is a con man, and he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. And when push comes to shove, he listens to Israel and Israeli interests. And of course, Israel has always been highly invested in the Syrian conflict, and there's no country that has more interest in destroying Syria than Israel, frankly. There's a lot of evidence of strong Israeli interest, and even now, they are, it's almost every few weeks they have jets overflying or flying along. They don't usually overfly Syria. They'll do their standoff missions where they're flying along the border and then shooting missiles from there, either the Lebanese border or the Jordanian border. So, but regarding Biden, of course, Biden was the main man in the Ukrainian coup. It was Victoria Nuland was the on the ground assistant secretary of state, but who was running things. But Joe Biden was overall in charge of it. And as much as Democrats like to say it's disinformation, the notion of Joe Biden being corrupt, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming there.
Oh, he's a war profiteer.
Yes.
I mean, all of the things that Donald Trump was talking about with the actual democratically elected head of state in Ukraine, the current guy there, Zelensky, when he was saying to him, hey, that when when Yanukovych was overthrown, Joe Biden and his son on the board of some gas company made a big profit. You actually should look into that. And of course, Trump was almost impeached for that. Right. He was almost impeached for just the fact that Joe Biden is a war profiteer. And for all of those people and for all of my friends in Europe, from Germany, England, Italy, and so forth, who all supported the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych because all of their European media outlets were all saying that this was a bunch of freedom fighters, people power, fighting against a corrupt right-wing government. Well, he was replaced by not only rival oligarchs, but a bunch of neo-Nazis. And when we're talking about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, we're not talking about, the stereotypical anti-Semitic, anti-Gypsy neo-Nazis, although they are that, but it's basically ultra-Ukrainian nationalists who don't want to have any, peace and reconciliation with their, Ukrainian brethren who mainly speak, Russian as opposed to Ukrainian.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the one good thing about on this issue is that there's a video of Joe Biden himself bragging about getting the attorney general who was looking into Burisma, the gas company that his son went onto the board of directors of, uh, bragging about having him fired, within 8 hours or something like that. There's if anybody is interested and has not yet seen that video, it's very interesting. Joe Biden bragging before the
But Rick,
forget what body.
but Rick, Joe Biden is the lesser evil. Joe
Mhm.
Biden is the lesser evil. He's going to bring normality. But anyways, I don't want to spend much time talking about that empty-headed windbag who's clearly, not the brightest bulb on the planets anymore. and and the
Right, right.
the fact of the matter is, I don't like Trump, but I don't like Joe Biden. These are two rival oligarchs. Nobody should be voting for them, whether you're a libertarian anti-imperialist or an eco-socialist and an anti-imperialist abroad from the left. You should not be voting for Joe Biden. And I know Peter Kuznick, past guest on the show, supports. He's going to be voting for Joe Biden, but I know completely where Peter's coming from. Peter's of the opinion that no other left party is going to win, so therefore hold your nose and vote for Joe Biden. But he's not voter shaming people who don't want to vote for Joe Biden. That
Yeah,
said, I'm
yeah.
of the much more explicit opinion of my hero Malcolm X that anyone who votes for Joe Biden and then has the nerve to complain that he's not, the left hope, well, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to the human race. But
but no judgment.
if people want to vote for him, okay. But you've lost all right to make fun of Trump supporters and to even make fun of Donald Trump himself when Joe Biden clearly
Yeah, yeah,
is not
yeah.
there anymore.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's very clear to me that Joe Biden, yeah, as you say, is not there. But he's had either a moderate stroke or worse. He shows all the symptoms of that disability.
But one last thing I wanted to ask you about Syria before we get into the anti-China and Russia hysteria, which I wanted to talk to you about, is okay. So Turkey is continuing to plunder Syria economically, export Islamists there, ethnically cleansing Kurds who have no quarrel with the country of Turkey, although Erdogan is using anti-Kurdish stuff to whip up ultra-Turkish nationalism for, for the people of his country to support what he's doing in Syria. But that leads back again to the question I asked you last time you came on the show, which is why doesn't Assad and the Russians and maybe and even Hezbollah and Iran all just get together again and kick the Turks out of Syria? Because again, isn't it stupid for the Russians and the Syrians to be meeting with the non-existent moderate rebels, the White Helmets, which are now the Violets, with Turkey, which was part of you know
Mm.
the mess that Assad Syria is in.
Mm. So why doesn't Turkey join with Syria or just enable Syria to
Or
kick out?
just leave the country. Just leave the
Yeah,
country.
right. I think the answer is that Turkey or that Russia is a big country. It is currently one of the major countries in the world. It's very influential, and yet they're in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism. And they are playing. On the one hand, they want to support Syria, and Syria has been allied with the Soviet Union and then Russia going back to the 60s. So there's a long history of relations there. Syria has a small Russian port. It has air base now. So I think Russia only has two external bases in the world. One of them is in apart from the Russia or the former states of the Soviet Union. There's a naval base in Vietnam, and there's a small naval station, very small actually, in Tartus in Syria. So there's a long history there, and but at the same time, they have to deal with the U.S. and the hostility of the U.S. and NATO. They're being surrounded. Almost every year, the situation gets worse, where NATO is creating a ring of bases around Russia, getting closer and closer. At the Baltic states, in Poland, in the south. So they would like to move Turkey away from NATO in a sense. So I think they do not want a head-on conflict either with Turkey or with the U.S. And that's why they're being restrained, frankly. You could call it patience, but they don't want to have a head-on conflict with the U.S. in Syria, and they don't want to have a head-on conflict with Turkey either. And that's why they have initiated the diplomatic talks, including Iran and Turkey and Russia, excluding the U.S. But you know, as much as its gains have been rather limited, there have been some gains. The M5 highway from running from Damascus to Aleppo is free now, open for transportation. The M4 highway from Latakia to Aleppo was supposed to be controlled by Russian and Turkish forces, but they have not been successful. They've been attacked by jihadis, and Turkey is kind of playing a double game. It seems to me that they're rather deceitful. They're signing these agreements and then reneging on them. But I think Putin and Russia and Lavrov and the Russian leadership knows that Turkey cannot be trusted, but at the same time, it's to their advantage. That at the same time, they don't want to get into a head-on conflict, because after all, NATO is a member of, Turkey is a member of NATO. So they're playing a diplomatic game, and they're the adults in the room. It looks to me.
Well, yeah, it's crazy, but that's why we need but if we had a real anti-war movement, and we wouldn't be in this situation. And then if there are more Tulsi Gabbards, in the actual diplomatic world, and people like Alfred Desaias, we wouldn't be in this situation. But
yeah,
I guess I guess we can only hope for the best, and I say best of luck to Assad and his allies, and those few anti-imperialists who are still trying to push back against the war in Syria.
I think if we look at the positive side, I think there's I think the tide is slowly changing. I think there's more leftists who are aware that maybe Assad isn't the enemy. Maybe the project to overthrow him was as the critics were saying. And so we've seen some influential people like Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal who were early in the conflict, who had a really poor position, and they've swung around and done a lot of very good investigations and reports.
The first time I interviewed you, the journalist I was mentioning a lot was Rania Khalek, who also wasn't exactly anti-Syrian war, but she realized, as an Arabic speaker, when she saw when she saw, Al Jazeera Arabic's hate channel of people talking about wiping out Alawites and all non-Sunnis.
Yes.
That this was another imperial war, just like Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s, Iraq and Libya. And actually, and before we change topic, because we were on the 9/11 anniversary, if people want to understand entirely how we got into this mess, then they need to buy this book, The Management of Savagery: How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump, by the journalist you mentioned, Max Blumenthal, and of course read the work you, Whitney Webb, and others have done at MintPress News. And
just to give a little extra plug there for Management of Savagery, I highly recommend it. He covers a lot of detail, but it's a very easy read. It's a surprisingly easy read. He's got a very good writing style, but it shows how the U.S. and the U.K. and the West has used and distorted Islam. Really, they've totally distorted Islam. They've used whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood in some countries or other Islamist forces, they boosted the sectarianism and they used it for political purposes. So Max's book is a very easy read, frankly, and it's very informative. I highly recommend it. If I could give a plug for one other book, I did a book review of Diana Johnstone's book. I don't know if you've come across that.
Actually, it was a fantastic review. In fact, a lot of times when you review documentaries and movies and debunk propaganda, that's where your media criticism and your NGO criticism comes in. And Diana Johnstone, I know for a fact that I think most of my viewers probably aren't going to be familiar with her, but she's a controversial. I think it's safe to say that she is a controversial journalist. I think a lot of that has to do with her coverage of Yugoslavia, which we're not going to get into, but it is a topic we're going to explore for another day. But anyways, your review of that book, of her memoir, really made me want to actually, basically in the future, I'm going to buy that memoir because it sounded way more interesting than no offense to Cy Hirsch, but it sounded way more interesting than Cy Hirsch's memoir. And because she's a true anti-imperialist, even though that means even opposing something like the bombing of Serbia, and I'm basically of that school of thought. I'm anti-war as a tactic, but I'm an anti-imperialist. Just because I'm not fond of the Chinese government, just because I'm not fond of Putin, just because I'm not fond of the current guy in Belarus, does not mean that they should be overthrown in Western-sponsored fake people power revolutions, and we weaponize half-truths, we weaponize legitimate grievances for more imperialism, which is propping up rival oligarchs and rival, xenophobic forces, which is why I'm not for the efforts to ouster the current leader of Belarus. It's why I'm not for the protests in Hong Kong. It's why I'm very much opposed to the anti-Putin derangement syndrome and propping up con artists like Navalny and Bill Browder, and why and it's also why I simply cannot support the war in Syria, because and Diana Johnstone is of that is of that school of thought, more or less.
Yeah, I think you're right. Have you had a chance to read that book yet?
No, I haven't, but I'm planning on getting in the future because I still have some other books I need to get through,
Yeah.
including this fantastic book about the British monarchy.
Well, just very briefly, the book is titled Circle in the Darkness, Memoir of a World Watcher. Diana Johnstone is, I think she's almost 80 years old. She grew up in Minnesota and Washington, D.C., but she's lived basically all of her adult life in Europe, in France for the most part, but also with stints in Germany and Italy. Anyway, the book is a review of a lot of critical events of the last 50 or 55 years. The assassination of Olof Palme, the somewhat progressive Swedish prime minister who was gunned down, murdered in an unsolved case. She's got a lot of insights on that. The Turkish assassination attempt on the Pope. She's got a lot on that. Yugoslavia, Hillary Clinton. There's really a wealth of information in there, and she comes from it. She brings a kind of an independent perspective, but I think there's a lot of integrity there, and there's a lot of looking for facts rather than opinions or propaganda. So she takes on the media in many cases, and she shows how basically the assault on Yugoslavia was very convenient for NATO, which was at its 50th anniversary. There was no Warsaw Pact anymore. So what did they need? What was the need for NATO? And they found a new need by converting from a defensive pact to an offensive pact and going on offense in Yugoslavia and basically busting up that country and ending up bombing Serbia for 78 days and continuing on to Libya in 2011 and so on and so forth. But I highly recommend it, and interested viewers can just search on her name, Diana Johnstone, and read some very good articles.
And then in the future, next time I have you on, we're definitely going to talk about that. And in fact, I actually, very briefly, I'll say I was actually talking with a friend of mine from Yugoslavia who actually supported the NATO bombing of Serbia. She's a half Kosovo Albanian. Her husband was a Kosovo Albanian. So they have a bit of a different perspective. And so one of these days, I was saying to her, okay, let's actually have a debate about Yugoslavia. Let me try to find. Let me ask one of the past guests on 1+1 if they're willing to do a debate about it. As long as everyone is very respectful and no personal attacks. And she said that she would think about it. So, but before we run out of time. Okay, actually, let me ask you this. Do you want to talk about the anti-China Russia hysteria, particularly in sports, and how that plays into the bigger picture? Or would you like to talk about the recent poisoning of the pseudo-fake Russian dissident Navalny?
Well, let me spend just before I get to that, maybe the Russia-China sports issue, but let me talk for a couple of more minutes because I think people may not be aware of the extent of U.S. interference in Syria. The U.S. has many bases. Now, these are small bases. There aren't a lot of troops there. There's, some people say there's 600, some are 800, some 1,200. But of course, these are just special operations forces. There's, many contractors that go along with that. And they're just kind of places, they are locking onto Syrian territory to prevent the Syrian government from reclaiming it and rebuilding it. They're playing the role of spoiler. Since they lost the military effort, the U.S. has now reverted to spoiler, where they try to undermine the economy in every way they can. And for example, the U.S. has a base at a border area in the south called El Tam, and they control this strategic area because it's the road from Baghdad to Damascus. And so the U.S. has placed themselves there. They train jihadis there. They have there's evidence that they have brought former ISIS fighters and retooled them for new purpose in the future. But they mostly are just preventing the Syrian government from using that area and using the roadway and to having the transportation, the main transportation route between Damascus and Baghdad. Then in the east, the U.S. has strategically location bases, or strategically located bases at the LMR oil field, the various oil fields around in eastern Syria. It's desert terrain. There's very little population, but the U.S. has claimed these oil fields, and under President Trump, we've secured the oil, and the U.S. is openly and explicitly processing the oil and using the money to finance its operations and finance its puppet army, which is called the Syrian Defense Forces, which is a name they cooked up in 24 hours when they were told to by a U.S. military officer. So it doesn't get more blatant and extreme than that. And in my article, I asked the question: what would the Americans think if a foreign power came across the border of Mexico, seized Texas, financed a secessionist militia, and paid for it with Texas oil, which they said was theirs? So it's just so blatant and in your face that it's pretty amazing, actually, and yet the world is aware, but nobody will say the emperor has no clothes. Now, moving on.
And if China or Russia did the same thing to England when it comes to Northern Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, or if they did that in Canada, in the province of Quebec, or Alberta, which has this ridiculous idea of seceding from Canada, they would be screaming bloody murder. But again, we can do this to you. You can never do this to us. We can meddle in your elections, and if one of our if our favorite rival oligarch loses, we're going to then accuse you of meddling, even though you didn't even meddle.
Yeah, exactly. It's hypocrisy. It's total hypocrisy, double standards, and might makes right. Frankly, the U.S. is just setting up their base and saying you aren't going to attack us, and if you make any moves in that direction, we will attack you first. And in fact, the U.S. did that at that El Temp base. Some Syrian troops entered within 100 kilometers of that area, and they were attacked by U.S. aircraft and killing a number of Syrian soldiers. So it's the rule of the jungle, really, and that's what we're dealing with, the loss of international law, frankly. The ambassador Jaffrey, the Syrian ambassador to the UN Security Council, he compared international law to a lamb being looked after by. Yes, exactly, and that's the case. So now, but going on to the question of sports and the propaganda campaign regarding China and Russia, this is something I started looking into it in of course the 2014 coup was completed in Ukraine in February of 2014, and The climax of that was snipers killing people on both sides of the confrontation between protesters and police. Both police were killed, protesters were killed. There was evidence that was later revealed that snipers did that from a certain building that had visibility on both sides, and that it was the snipers were from the opposition side. Well, and the question is, I think that was expedited. That case was the incident and the confrontation, the coup, what became the coup, was expedited because over in Russia, in Sochi, the Olympics were going on and were coming to a close at the end of February. I think they wanted to do that, get the coup over with before the Olympics completed, while Russia and the Russian leadership was mindful of the International Olympics going on in its territory. Then 2 years later, in 2016, there was the Rio Olympics, and prior to that, there was the World Anti-Doping Agency based in Montreal, Canada, came up with a report, and they identified the head of the Moscow laboratories as being an extremely corrupt person, not believable, and having been involved in and basically covering up positive drug tests of Russian athletes for money. And then that evolved into an overall attack on the Russian state system and government, where they were claiming it was actually state sponsored. And that was a huge morphing from saying the responsibility was this individual and a few associates of Grigory Rodchenkov was the name of the head of the laboratory, and blaming the Russian government, and then outlawing all of the track and field athletes from the Rio Olympics. So you've got a huge leap of accusations of responsibility, and a huge leap from saying some individual athletes were guilty of doping and should be excluded, to saying that, well, if you're Russian, we're not going to allow you. The whole entire Paralympic team was disallowed they were excluded from the Rio Olympics, the Paralympics games that immediately follow the Olympics games. So that was all very interesting, and I looked into it in some detail, and I found the evidence of state-sponsored doping was very, very thin. It was basically came down to just accusations, and the primary person making the accusations.
So you don't think that there's any half-truths involved which get weaponized? It's mostly like, okay, if you're going to do an investigation, do an independent investigation, but to say straight out that Russia, that the entire Russian system, which is basically what they're saying, all Russian people are corrupt, and therefore they're not allowed to fly a flag at the Olympics.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like a conspiracy theory times 1,000. They were saying that all of these thousands of Russian athletes were involved in doping and hiding, covering it up, and so forth, so on and so forth. It doesn't make any sense right on the face of it. You wouldn't. Why would a person who was an athlete pay money for a doping substance, which is going to jeopardize their whole career and their name and their reputation and everything else? It doesn't make any sense. In fact, for some sports, it's even. I mean, what drug would you take as a pole jumper? What drug would you take to improve your pole vaulting performance or curling?
Or even, yeah, exactly. I was just about to say, yeah.
And 2 years later, the Russian pairs curling champions at the at the Winter Olympics in South Korea 2 years later in 2018, um, were tested positive. The man tested positive for meldonium. Well, meldonium is a valid medical treatment for a person with a weak heart. It helps to strengthen the heart for somebody who's got palpitations. But I mean, even the fellow curlers were laughing at doping and curling. I mean, there's nothing more intense than sweeping the ice ahead of the rock. So there's a lot of logical failures. But to come back to the core person in all this is Gregory Rodchenkov, who very conveniently went to the United States and went into secret hiding. And then there's been a movie made about him. Just came out with a book. And in the US Congress, they've got something called the Rodchenkov Act, which is going to attempt to make U.S. law, any athlete in the world or any person in the law is going to be supposedly liable under this act, and if they are involved in doping, that they can be prosecuted and can have financial penalties imposed on them. So once again, it's the U.S. asserting the right to be not just the policeman of the world, the judge and jury and executioner for athletics in the world.
Do you think that this Russian individual that that you mentioned, who supposedly fled to the U.S. because he's afraid of his life there, because he's apparently exposed systemic doping going on, do you think they made him into an asset where he decides, okay, because I have probably not a great life in Russia, I can have a better life in America if I just weaponize half truths against Putin and align myself with rival oligarchs in Russia, that this is basically all fake, that he's a fake whistleblower and a fake political refugee, just like all those North Koreans who defect and they start coming up with all these nonsense stories that that Kim Jong-il assassinates basketball players who don't win basketball games, and he murders people if they don't have the same haircut as him. Like, do you think that's what this Russian was like, pretty much?
Well,
like
Rodchenkov,
like Chalabi of Iraq.
yes, Ahmed Chalabi. Rodchenkov is a complicated person. He was a talented, scientist in his area, but he's also a very troubled person. He attempted suicide. He was imprisoned in Russia for drug dealing. And yet I think, I mean, there was definitely some, he was involved in drugs, he was involved in positive testing, he was involved in trying to game the system. That much is clear, and that comes out in the World Anti-Doping Agency report of 2015, of late 2015. And they said he was not to be trusted. And that is true today. The transformation takes place when he was in Russia. He was removed as the head of the Moscow laboratory. So his career there was pretty much over. What a magical transformation he made coming to the U.S., where suddenly he's a whistleblower. Suddenly he's under protective custody. He doesn't have to work, really. Suddenly he's a hero because he's making all the accusations against Russia. The thing is, if I was him, I would be a little worried, because his usefulness for the U.S. and the anti-Russia propaganda campaign is about over. He's done everything he could to damage Russian sports. And the only thing that could happen to him now was if he was to die, maybe from Novichok poisoning. if he was to die now, immediately the cry would be, "Oh, the Russians did it." When in fact he would be much more useful to the CIA at this point, dead than alive, because he's done all the damage he could do, and all that could
Well,
happen
just
now
yeah.
is that he could be exposed as a liar, and some of his accusations could come out and be disproven. So I would, if I was him, I'd be looking over my shoulder, frankly, not at the Russians. They don't at this point. They don't care. They dislike him. They say he was a traitor. They say he was a liar. But I would be concerned about the people who put him on a pedestal and have everything to gain by him suddenly dying.
Well, James Lemasurier, the British deep state agent who created the Islamist front group, the White Helmets, which NATO, Gulf, American, and Canadians, made to stir shit up in Syria. He was mysteriously suicided or mysteriously murdered. So it goes to show you that when you sleep with dogs, when you sleep with these imperialist dogs, you're going to catch fleas.
Yeah,
And now the White Helmets have become the violets. Vanessa Beeley, who's now part of Whitney Webb's fantastic independent media project Unlimited Hangout, has exposed that now the White Helmets have become, the violets.
Yeah, yeah. It's time for a color change.
While we're but before we get to the anti-China historia,
one thing, Youri, is I actually have another commitment in a few minutes here. It's so much fun talking with you. Time has flown.
All right. Well. Before I let you go, I do have to mention this. Continuing with what you were saying about the fake Russian whistleblower, is that Navalny, this Russian dissident who was poisoned. People need to know this. He's not a liberal, and he's not a liberal, nor is he even socially liberal. He's a rival oligarch, and he actually once made a video where he said that he wanted Russia to make gun control less strict so that we can shoot Muslims since they're cockroaches.
Wow.
He is not a Russian dissident. He's just a rival oligarch. And his friend Bill Browder, who was an oligarch who looted the Russian economy during the Yeltsin years. The only reason Mr. Bill Browder hates Putin so much is because Putin said, "Under me, you're no longer going to have fun in my country." And these are the two figures where we get a lot of the anti-Putin propaganda. Even though Putin's not, though Putin is an autocratic person, but a lot of the campaign against him is mostly propaganda and half truths being weaponized.
Well, regarding Navalny, very briefly, I think the key question comes up is who benefits. Who benefits from his suddenly getting seriously ill? It's basically, Nord Stream 2 is the final segment of it is to be built. And so the Navalny case and the accusations of that he was poisoned by Russia with Novichok. I mean, it's almost laughable. If the Russians were going, I mean, number one, he's more of a headache to them dead than alive or sick or poisoned or whatever, because he was just a politician with a small following, fairly vocal, but it was not a serious threat to the government in Russia or the leading parties, the Communist Party or the All Russia Party, Russia United Party. He's much more of a problem in this situation. And also, all of a sudden, the Germans are asking about Nord Stream 2, and it's fuel for the fire of the NATO accusations against Russia. So who benefits from this chain of events? It's not Russia.
Exactly, but we really need we need a whole new school of anti-propaganda studies, because it is incredible how so many left-leaning people are continuing to jump the shark for the next imperial imperial beats. But
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're really right. So maybe we should wrap it up for now, Youri. I've enjoyed talking with you very much.
well, Rick,
It's
it's
great.
it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I've been trying, on and off to get people like Max Blumenthal,
Yeah,
Rania Kalik, Rania Masri on the show without much success. But
yeah,
1+1 is a show where we also want to give a platform to people I feel are criminally underrated, which is why I have Eve Angler. It's why I get Whitney Webb on the show. It's why I get other people like David Swanson. You are one of the best journalists I know on Syria, and also on on any topic. And so that said, thank you. So that said, thank you for coming on the show, and to be
okay.
continued. And we'll definitely
Yeah.
organize coming back on.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be fun, Youri. Okay, take care. All the best.
All right,
Bye bye.
ciao,
Bye
ciao,
bye.
Rick.